That's what the physician whispered. One splinter of wood long, jagged, unforgiving had pierced beneath the helmet, right through the visor, and plunged into the soft meat behind the royal eye. The king did not die at once. That would have been too merciful. Instead, over 10 days of royal agony, France watched its monarch fall apart day by day, organ by organ, breath by blood. Now, as the king's body betrayed him, his brain swelling, pus oozing from his temple, Catherine took control, not just of the court, but of his final hours. She locked the doors. She forbade visits. Not even Diane de Poitiers, the king's lifelong mistress, was allowed to see him. The grand wedding celebration of two powerful empires, France and Savoy, had just climaxed in fireworks and silk. They called her a queen of poison and grief. But now, behind the thick curtains of the Louvre, the celebration soured into silence. The smell of lavender gave way to rot, and the King Henry II, once the embodiment of French strength, became a carcass still wearing a crown. Only one figure held the keys to his chamber: Catherine de Medici, the queen, the Italian outsider, the woman who had waited for 2 decades in the shadows while Henry lavished his love on another woman. No prayers could reach the dying king. No sunlight touched his skin. Only Catherine did, and she stayed watching, waiting. Was it love, or was it vengeance? The palace whispered. They called her cruel, but no one could deny. In that moment, she ruled. It all began with a wedding. It ended with a funeral, and somewhere between the two, a man burned from within, while the woman beside him decided the fate of a kingdom. If this story haunts you already, wait until you uncover what Catherine did behind the locked doors of the royal bedchamber. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of love, death, and power in one of the darkest weddings in French history. France in the 16th century was a kingdom painted in blood and gold. The Valois dynasty sat uneasy on the throne, caught between wars of religion, fragile alliances, and the growing power of rival houses. In the center of this delicate web was a queen who was never meant to rule, and a king who never truly loved her. Catherine de Medici was born into wealth, but orphaned early. She was the daughter of the powerful Medici family of Florence merchants, bankers, patrons of the arts, and wielders of quiet power. Henry ascended the throne as King Henry II of France, and Catherine was crowned queen. Yet even as queen, she remained second to Diane in the king's heart. Two grand marriages were being held at once, one between Catherine's daughter, Elizabeth of Valois, and the King of Spain, another between her sister, Marguerite, and the Duke of Savoy. On the final tilt, Montgomery's lance shattered. A sliver of wood, long and sharp, shot through the king's open visor, straight into his right eye. For once, Catherine stood at the center of the stage, smiling among silks and tapestries, basking in the glory of dynastic triumph. But even then, Henry rode high, confident, proud, reckless. She had no say in council. She held no real power. Her court was Diane's court. It was a slow descent into rot. Catherine begged him not to. The astrologers warned against it, but the king refused. He would ride, not just as ruler, but as man, knight, and lover, strong and untouchable. And so Catherine learned patience not as a virtue, but as a weapon, as a girl. Catherine was considered clever, sharp-tongued, and politically aware. But when she was married off at 14 to Prince Henry of France, she was not embraced by the French court. Physicians surrounded him, performing agonizing procedures, trepanation, bloodletting, poultices. The king screamed for days. His face swelled, his skin burned with fever, his mind flickered in and out of clarity. She was Italian. She was plain, and worse, she was powerless. His brain was hemorrhaging. The stench of infection filled the royal suite. On July 10, 1559, King Henry II of France died not in glory, but in agony. From the moment Catherine arrived in France, she lived in the shadows. Her new husband showed her little affection. Instead, his heart and body belonged to another woman, Diane de Poitiers, a glamorous, intelligent widow 20 years his senior. She pushed the physicians aside and personally supervised her husband's care. She summoned her confessor, her loyal advisors, and her children to her side. But she denied Diane de Poitiers, the woman who had stood beside the king for over 20 years, any access to say goodbye. Diane wrote letters. She begged. But the door remained closed. While Catherine bore child after child for the dynasty, Diane held the king's confidence, guided his politics, and even signed royal documents in his name. She wore black and white, the king's colors. She lived in royal castles meant for queens, and in the portraits of the age, it is Diane who shines beside the king, not his lawful wife. For decades, Catherine endured this humiliation. She raised her children, she watched from the margins, and she waited. She learned to mask her fury with poise, to hide her ambitions behind motherhood. But inside, she was studying everything, every weakness, every betrayal, every door she was denied. Then, in 1547, Henry's father, Francis I, died. The weapon would find his target in the summer of 1559. The French court was alive with celebration as part of the wedding festivities. Henry insisted on participating in a joust, a medieval sport that had long gone out of fashion. He rode against a young nobleman, Gabriel de Montgomery. In the first passes, the crowd roared. The silence was immediate. Henry fell from his horse, bleeding from the face, trembling. He was taken inside. The court froze. This was not a clean death. And Catherine? She took control. For the first time, she issued the orders. She decided who could enter the king's chamber and who could not. Catherine did not shout. She did not gloat. But she made sure the king died in her presence alone. By the 10th day, the king's eye had liquefied. And at last, Catherine de Medici emerged from the shadows, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a sovereign. The wound was small, at first, just a sliver. But it festered, deep and unseen, like everything else that had been buried for years in the Valois court. His eye socket was swollen shut, black and red, oozing with infection. His breathing grew thick, ragged. Surgeons cut into his skull to relieve the pressure. But the tools were primitive, blood spilled across embroidered sheets each day. His mind drifted further into delirium. He called for his mother long dead. He moaned Diane's name in his sleep, and sometimes he spoke in Latin as if begging God to end it in the royal bedchamber. Henry II burned, but God was silent. Only Catherine answered. She held a book of prayers in one hand, and in the other a quiet power she had never been permitted to wield. Servants no longer looked to the king. They looked to her. Guards took orders from her. Ministers came to her chambers, not his. She sat beside him, day and night, unflinching, her expression calm, almost serene. The queen, for the first time, had become the axis of the realm. But her power came wrapped in whispers. Why was Diane barred from seeing him? Others believe she forced him to renounce Diane in his final hours. There is no proof. But in the 10 days of Henry's decline, Catherine erased the woman who had once erased her. Why did Catherine dismiss certain physicians? Why was she seen smiling on the 2nd day of the king's agony? Because Catherine had loved Henry. In her own way, she had borne him 10 children. She had waited faithfully, even silently, as he discarded her. Now, as he moaned in fever and blood, she was the last face he saw. Others whispered that she was waiting for her revenge to ripen. Each hour, he slipped further into seizures, hallucinations, mutterings. On the 8th day, his left side went limp. On the 9th, his pupils stopped responding. By the 10th, he no longer spoke. It was about years of humiliation, about a woman who had swallowed decades of loneliness while watching another woman rule in her place. Diane de Poitiers had stolen her husband's affection, her position, and the spotlight of the court. Catherine had been forced to endure childbirth after childbirth while her rival signed royal edicts. She wrote in her journal that she was unmoored, unsure whether God was testing her resolve or rewarding it, crown still resting on the nightstand beside him, no longer worn. On the 7th day, she stopped eating. Her cheekbones sharpened, Her eyes darkened. One maid noted. It was as if the queen was becoming shadow. The court, once bustling with celebration, transformed into a palace of shadows. Curtains were drawn. Visitors were denied. Silence fell over the Louvre like a velvet shroud. Outside the palace, France held its breath. No bulletins, no updates. The king had vanished behind a wall of secrecy, and Catherine held the key each morning. She would descend into the sick room. Wrapped in black and gold, she walked slowly, deliberately, not as a grieving wife but as something else, something colder. Then she placed her hand on his chest and waited for silence. Some said she was mourning, because this death was not only about the king's flesh. Now, Diane was on the outside, reduced to scribbled letters and desperate requests. Catherine read them, then folded them, then burned them. Some servants reported that the queen had the king's signet ring removed and sent back to her chambers before he died. It was not a scream. It was a slow suffocation. And yet this was not just vengeance. It was grief, too. Complex, twisted grief. Not Diane. Her. And it broke something inside her. On the fifth night, Catherine collapsed in prayer. Not for his life, but for clarity. And still, Henry lingered. His body fought the rot. But it was a lost battle. At last, Catherine gave the order. No more leeches. No more drills. No more physicians. She dismissed the surgeons. She extinguished the last candle by the bedside. It came in the early hours of July 10th. He died slowly, breath shallow, skin damp. In that moment, Catherine did not cry. She stood, smoothed her black gown, and walked out. Behind her, the body of the king, bloated, broken, and abandoned, lay in stillness. The woman who had entered France as a powerless child had now become a widow, with the entire monarchy in her hands. But it had cost her everything. They called her La Reine Noire, the Black Queen, in the weeks after Henry's death. Catherine de Medici no longer wept, no longer trembled, no longer lingered in doorways waiting to be invited. She had passed through fire and emerged untouched by flame, but cloaked in ash. The woman who once waited behind curtains was now the one drawing them. She dressed in solemn black, the color she would wear for the rest of her life, and took the regency of the crown. Her son, Francis II, was only 15, a boy king with a fragile body and a frightened mind. Catherine became his voice, his eyes, his decisions. But the throne no longer belonged to Henry, nor truly to Francis. And yet, power is never clean. The court expected mourning. France expected retreat. But Catherine did not disappear. It belonged to her. Others claimed they saw her wandering the palace corridors alone, fingering a blood-stained handkerchief. She banned Diane de Poitiers from court and seized her lands. The woman who had once eclipsed her was now erased from history, portraits taken down, gifts confiscated, her name barely spoken, and that terrified everyone. Courtiers flattered her, but never trusted her. France was spiraling toward religious war. The Huguenots, French Protestants, were rising in number and militancy. Nobles were turning against the crown. She surrounded herself with Italian advisors who stirred even more suspicion among the French elite. She began to be viewed not as a queen mother, but as a sorceress, a woman who wielded unnatural power, who had orchestrated her husband's death for political gain. The Valois dynasty, so fragile already, began to shake under the weight of uncertainty. In private, Catherine grew cold, calculated, and visibly thinner. Some said she whispered to the empty throne at night. But vengeance had a price. With Henry gone, Catherine had what she always longed for: visibility, influence, command. She visited it only once, in the dead of night, months after the funeral. A servant claimed she sat there for hours, unmoving, hands folded, as if expecting the king to speak to her from the darkness. She had devoted decades to a man who used her for lineage and left her for lust. And when she had finally seized him in death, what had it brought her? He didn't. He never would. She paced. She stared out windows. Once, she tore a dress apart with her bare hands after reading a letter signed with Diana's name. When her son Francis II died a year later, Catherine fell into a stupor so deep that ministers feared she would never rise again. But it did not feel like triumph. It felt like an echo chamber filled only with her own voice, and the sounds of others obeying it, and in the silence, she was haunted. The room where Henry died remained locked. Catherine ordered it preserved. Untouched, his bed still unmade, linen-stained. The last thing Henry ever said to her was unclear. Some say it was her name. Others swear it was Diane's. Catherine never confirmed. Now, she ruled a fractured kingdom but alone. Her children feared her. This was isolation in its purest form. For the rest of her life, she would fight to hold the kingdom together through civil war, betrayal, and the massacre of thousands. But she would do so carrying a hollowed core. A part of her had died with the king, not the wife, not the mother, but the woman who once believed that love could earn her a place in history. And Catherine, finally at the top, felt the ground slipping beneath her feet. She started relying on astrologers, alchemists, spies. She brought Nostradamus to court. The rumors became unbearable. She poisoned the king. She cursed Diane with a hex. She communes with the dead. The same silence she once weaponized now turned inward, echoing with accusation. Worse still, the love she had once quietly nourished, even if never returned, had turned into a rotting shrine. A dead husband, a fragile boy king, a kingdom ready to burn. This was not victory. At state ceremonies, Catherine stood tall and veiled, her face pale and unreadable. But in private, her maids reported long nights without sleep, and yet she did, because Catherine, though broken, would not vanish. But the price she paid on Henry's deathbed never left her. Now, only power remained, and power, for Catherine de Medici, was a cold and joyless inheritance. What happens when a woman is denied everything except Tom? Catherine de Medici's story is not just a tale of political maneuvering or royal tragedy. It is a psychological portrait of female power. Forged in absence, for most of her life, Catherine had no voice, no love, no respect. She was the queen, yes, but in name only. But Catherine, she endured, quietly, relentlessly, like a root system growing in darkness. Her body was used to produce heirs. Her presence was tolerated, not celebrated. Her thoughts were dismissed. Her pain was unseen. But that view is incomplete. It misses the psychology beneath. But she waited. She advised the king, signed with his seal, and enjoyed public affection. Catherine endured the humiliation in silence. She mothered children while watching another woman hold her husband's heart. She raised a royal generation, alone, while being treated as ornamental. She swallowed grief until it became ritual. And this is what makes her so haunting. History often celebrates queens who shine. Elizabeth I, Cleopatra, Marie Antoinette, women who defied, dazzled, or died spectacularly. The moment Henry II's eye was pierced, that root broke through the surface, a war that kills all the men, over and over. The path to female agency is paved in absence. She orchestrated compromises, masked truths, and tried to keep her dynasty alive through force of will. But she never truly escaped suspicion. She was called a witch, a poisoner, a schemer. History gave her many names, few of them kind. The husband she had once wanted was now a decaying figure in a bed she did not choose. Her reign began in death, and it would never escape its shadow. The bride rejected in France, the queen overshadowed by a mistress. The wife who watched her husband die not in her arms, but in a chamber of agony she couldn't stop. And when she did stop it, when she let the silence fall, she did not find peace, only responsibility. It is easy to judge Catherine by the surface facts. She barred a dying man as mistress, took control of the monarchy, and consolidated her power while her husband bled out. It was the grief of someone who realized that the thing she had waited for was never truly hers. Catherine was not just seizing control, she was reclaiming herself. For over 2 decades, Diane de Poitiers had lived as the real queen in everything but title. She is something rare, A woman forced to survive a life she never truly chose, and then punished for surviving it too well. Then suddenly, that structure collapsed. Henry was dying. Diane was locked out. And Catherine, at last, was the one everyone turned to. But by then, love had already curdled. Her chance at intimacy had rotted into spectacle. Catherine's grief was not the grief of a widow. It is about the bitterness of finally holding the crown, only to find it cold, blood-stained, and empty. And in that, she becomes a symbol far deeper than just Queen Regent. She wanted to matter, and by the end of Henry's life, she did. But at a cost no one should have to pay. She becomes a reflection of how women in history have often only found power through personal loss, a husband's death, a son's coronation. But Catherine reminds us that this power is rarely joyful. She would go on to rule France through some of its most brutal years: religious civil war, rebellion, assassination. Yet none of those labels captured the loneliness at her core. The little girl orphaned in Florence. There is something tragically modern in Catherine's art. She is not the villain of her own story, but neither is she the hero. That is the discomfort at the heart of her legacy. She was not soft enough to be loved, not cruel enough to be feared, not foolish enough to be pitied. So instead, she was remembered as dangerous, but beneath that shadow, there was always a human pulse, a woman who wanted to be more than a pawn, more than a womb, more than a name on a marriage contract. Catherine de Medici's story is not about ambition, it's about what ambition becomes when everything else is denied. There is a portrait of Catherine, painted years after Henry's death. She is seated in black, veiled, her face pale and sharp, her eyes unreadable. Behind her, the background is empty. No throne, no banners, no children, just darkness. She looks less like a queen and more like a ghost watching over the ruins of a life never fully lived. But if you look closer beyond the propaganda, beyond the hatred, what you see is a woman who built her entire existence around one man. And when that man died, she had no one left to be but powerful. History remembers Catherine de Medici as a schemer, a cold strategist, a woman who wore black and whispered to astrologers, and that power never loved her back. In the end, Catherine didn't burn her husband. He was already burning from arrogance, from pride, from the rot of a court too obsessed with glory. She simply stood by the fire and didn't look away.